The news hit Earth like a lightning bolt. Across the globe, screens flashed the images of the Velgrin fleet retreating, their massive warships vanishing into the vastness of space. In the United Earth Defense Command, UEDC, a silence fell over the room as leaders and military officials stared at the message coming from the Velgrin High Command. The words were simple, almost clinical. "We are withdrawing from the conflict. Your species is on its own." General Marcus Dalton sat in the command center, his fingers gripping the edge of the table, trying to process the enormity of what had just occurred. He had spent years coordinating with the Velgrins, believing that their advanced technology and military expertise would be humanity's key to surviving the onslaught of the Zalar hive. The Velgrins had promised to stand with Earth until the bitter end. But now, in a single decision, they had abandoned humanity to face the Zalars alone. The room erupted into chaos. Officers shouted orders to scramble the fleets, but deep down, they all knew this was a devastating blow. The Velgrins, with their superior warships and massive fleets, had been humanity's shield. Without them, Earth was exposed. No one knew exactly why the Velgrins had chosen this moment to retreat. Was it fear? Greed? A calculation that they would be better off on their own? Dalton didn't have time to consider their motives. He turned sharply to his second-in-command, Colonel Sarah Ortiz. "Get me the president," he said, his voice steady, though a storm raged in his chest. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Ortiz nodded and made the call, but Dalton knew it wouldn't change anything. The Velgrins were already pulling back their forces, abandoning Earth's orbit, and leaving the planet exposed to the full fury of the Zalars. As the holographic map of Earth's defense network flickered to life in front of them, Dalton felt the weight of the decision ahead. Earth's military was strong, but it wasn't nearly strong enough to fight the Zalars, especially without the Velgrins. And yet Dalton couldn't shake the feeling that the only thing humanity had ever truly had was its resolve. "What now?" Ortiz asked, breaking him from his thoughts. Her eyes were fierce, but there was an edge of uncertainty in them. Everyone had expected an invasion. Everyone had been preparing for a fight. But no one had anticipated being left alone in the dark. "We fight," Dalton said with unwavering certainty. "We fight like we always have. We might not have the technology, the numbers, or the support, but we have something no one else can take away: our will." Across the room, the various officers exchanged looks. The weight of Dalton's words hung heavy in the air. The room was filled with the silent understanding that they had just been abandoned by their strongest ally, and yet, despite it all, they couldn't simply give up. Not when so many innocent lives were at stake. The holographic display showed the first signs of the Zalar fleet on the horizon, their monstrous ships closing in on Earth's position. Dalton exhaled slowly, pushing the grief aside. The Zalars had no idea what they were about to face. "This is our world," Dalton continued, his voice a low growl, "and we'll burn it to the ground before we let them take it from us." The officers stood tall, nodding in agreement. It was time to put the plan into motion. No matter what happened, they would defend Earth. And if the Zalars thought humanity would fall without the Velgrins, they had another thing coming. As the first wave of Zalar ships entered Earth's orbit, a palpable sense of urgency spread across the planet. Humanity had been abandoned, but they would not surrender. General Marcus Dalton stood before the United Earth Defense Forces, UEDF, his jaw clenched, eyes burning with the fury of 100 battles. The Velgrins had left them to die, but they were wrong. Earth was not ready to fall. "Listen up," Dalton's voice rang out across the room, steady but filled with a quiet rage. "We've been left to face this alone, but we're not backing down. We are human, and we fight for our survival, for our families, for our world. Today, we show the galaxy what we're made of." His words were more than just a rallying cry. They were a declaration. Earth would stand. The UEDF had already begun preparing for a defense they hadn't thought they'd need this soon. The Zalars were relentless, But humanity had something the Zailers could never understand: adaptability. They had faced threats before, and they had always found a way to survive. The Zailers, with their vast numbers and insectoid fleet, were an overwhelming force, their ships descending like a plague. Massive, organic warships littered the sky, their spiked hulls bristling with weapons. The first strikes were brutal. Cities across the globe fell under the weight of the Zealer bombardment, their drones raining destruction from above, unstoppable and swift. Humanity's cities, San Francisco, Paris, Moscow, were reduced to smoldering ruins in mere hours. But as the Zailers attacked, something changed. The humans on the ground didn't cower. They didn't run. They fought. Resistance groups formed quickly, from organized militias to the remnants of military units that had not yet been mobilized. Every soldier, every civilian with the will to fight, picked up arms. Children were sheltered in the underground bunkers, while mothers and fathers fought side by side with soldiers, all determined to protect their homes. Humanity, against all odds, had become a united force. "General," Ortiz said, walking up beside Dalton as they watched the destruction unfold on the monitors. "We have one shot at this. If we don't slow them down, we'll be overrun. What's the plan?" Dalton looked at the map, a mix of red and orange dots marking Zealer positions. His mind raced, but he knew there was no time for hesitation. He took a breath and turned to his second-in-command. "We can't win by fighting them head-on. Our only hope is to hit them where it hurts, cut their supply lines, disrupt their command structure. We take the fight to them. We fight dirty." Ortiz raised an eyebrow, but she understood. Humanity had never fought by the rules, and it was time to use that to their advantage. Dalton continued, "We'll use guerrilla tactics, small, fast attacks that confuse and wear them down. We'll draw them into traps, hit their communication relays, and take out their supply ships. The more we disrupt them, the more they'll have to stretch their forces thin. And when we've done enough damage, we'll strike at their fleet directly." It was a risky strategy, but humanity had no other choice. The Zailers couldn't be beaten in a conventional battle. They were too strong. But they weren't invincible. With the plan set, the UEDF began its strike. Elite teams were deployed to sabotage Zealer ground positions, planting explosives and ambushing supply convoys. Meanwhile, other units focused on harassing their orbital forces, making use of humanity's small but nimble space fleet. The Zailers, accustomed to crushing their enemies in one fell swoop, were caught off guard by humanity's unrelenting, unpredictable tactics. And on the ground, humans fought like animals cornered in a cage. Streets turned into battlegrounds, with every inch of ground fought for tooth and nail. It was brutal, it was exhausting, and it felt like an impossible battle. But humanity had made a choice. They would fight until their last breath. The Zailers were not prepared for this kind of resistance. They had never encountered a species that would fight so fiercely in the face of annihilation. And as the days turned into weeks, one thing became clear: the Zailers had underestimated humanity. "We're not done yet," Dalton muttered to himself, watching the screens flicker with the latest reports of resistance victories. "This is just the beginning." And with that, the real battle began. The Zailers had arrived in full force, and Earth's defenses, though valiant, were beginning to crack under the weight of their overwhelming numbers. The first wave of Zealer ships, colossal and menacing, had entered Earth's atmosphere, casting long shadows over the cities below. Their size alone was enough to strike fear into anyone who looked up at the skies. The Zealer ships didn't merely hover, they seemed to loom asterisk, their jagged alien shapes dominating the sky. Humanity's military forces had been hastily mobilized, but they were still no match for the sheer scale of the invasion. In the first few hours, cities fell under an onslaught of energy blasts. Entire skyscrapers collapsed as Zealer ships unleashed their devastating weaponry from above. Every major city became a battleground, with the air filled with explosions and the screams of civilians scrambling for safety. Despite the devastation, there was something undeniable in the way humanity responded. The streets were not just filled with fleeing civilians, they were filled with defiant fighters. Even as the bombs fell, people picked up weapons, anything they could find, and joined the resistance. Ordinary citizens, from farmers to teachers to engineers, took to the streets, fighting back with everything they had. In the chaos, General Dalton was everywhere at once. His soldiers followed his every order with precision, coordinating hit-and-run tactics in the urban wasteland. Yet even as their small victories mounted, Dalton knew that the clock was ticking. The Zailers were relentless, and they would not stop until they had ground Earth into dust. In the early hours of the assault, Dalton's forces attempted a direct attack on one of the Zailer command ships hovering over the ruins of New York City. A small fleet of fighter jets, outfitted with experimental weaponry, launched a surprise attack, weaving through the massive enemy ships. They made a daring strike at one of the Zailer's smaller craft, sending it spiraling into the ocean below. It was a victory, but a small one. The enemy fleet was still massive, and the remaining Zailers retaliated with brutal efficiency. Meanwhile, in the heart of what had once been Paris, Colonel Sarah Ortiz led a small team of UEDF soldiers in a guerrilla raid against the Zailers' ground forces. Using the cover of the city's shattered buildings, they launched a surprise attack on a Zailer command post that had been set up in the heart of the ruins. The Zailers, accustomed to large-scale, methodical combat, were caught off guard by the human forces that attacked in smaller, unpredictable waves. "We can't keep this up forever," Ortiz said as they moved through the wreckage, her voice low but steady. The crackling radio in her hand conveyed the urgency of the situation. Zailer drones swarmed the skies above them, searching for any human movements, and the ground forces were beginning to regroup for a counteroffensive. "We don't need forever," Dalton's voice came through the comm. "We just need to make them bleed. We hit them now, disrupt their operations, and buy time for the next phase. Keep pushing." Every soldier in Ortiz's team knew that every minute they bought would make a difference. If they could slow the Zailers just a little longer, they would be giving humanity the chance to regroup, to build up their defenses and develop new weapons. But every moment of success came at a cost. With each Zailer they took down, 2 more seemed to take their place. By the end of the 3rd day, Earth's cities were in ruins. The Zailers, unable to fully crush the human spirit, began to shift tactics. Rather than simply annihilating everything in their path, they began setting up strongholds on the planet's surface, trying to establish a foothold for their next wave of destruction. But humanity's forces were far from finished. Every corner of Earth became a battleground, and every human who could hold a weapon was now a fighter in the war. General Dalton stood on a command ship overlooking the shattered ruins of the former cityscape. The reports were grim. Human casualties were mounting, but so were the Zailer losses. The battle was far from won, but humanity had something the Zailers had never expected: the willingness to fight, even when the odds were impossible. "We're not backing down," Dalton muttered to himself, watching the war unfold before him. "Not now. Not ever." And with that, the true heart of humanity's resistance began to shine through, even as the battle raged on. The Zailers might have underestimated them, but they would soon learn that humanity would never give up, no matter how high the cost. The fighting on the ground was brutal, and humanity's forces were feeling the strain. Despite the resilience and determination of Earth's soldiers, the Zailers were simply too numerous, and their tactics too devastating. Entire cities had fallen. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the ruins of once thriving metropolises. Earth was under siege, and time was running out. But just when it seemed that hope was slipping away, a breakthrough came in the form of Dr. Elara Miles, a brilliant scientist who had been working in secret for months. She had been developing a weapon that could shift the tides of the war, a weapon humanity could use to strike back against the Zailers with devastating force. Dr. Miles had been working alongside a team of engineers and military experts, piecing together technologies salvaged from the Velgrin Alliance and humanity's own innovation. The weapon, a massive energy cannon, was designed to fire a concentrated burst of energy capable of obliterating Zealer ships. If it worked, it could turn the tide of the war. But there was a catch. The cannon was incomplete. Its power core was still unstable, and it hadn't been tested in real combat. Dr. Miles knew that it could either save humanity or destroy what was left of Earth's infrastructure. It was a gamble, but with the Zealers at their doorsteps, they had no other choice. In a hastily organized meeting, General Dalton and his commanders gathered in a makeshift command center beneath the ruins of a war-torn city. The atmosphere was tense. Outside, the hum of distant artillery fire and the faint sounds of combat reminded them of the stakes. Dr. Miles, her face pale and weary from sleepless nights, stood before them with a holographic display showing the weapon's design. "This is our only hope," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "If we can get the cannon operational, we can destroy Zealer ships with a single shot. But I need time to stabilize the power core. If we rush it, it could backfire, and we'll lose everything." Dalton studied the display, his mind racing. The Zealers were too close now. Every minute they waited allowed the enemy to dig in further, fortifying their position. But he understood the risks. "How long do you need, Dr. Miles?" "At least 48 hours, she replied, her eyes not meeting his. "If we push it, I might be able to get it ready in half that time, but there's no guarantee." Dalton glanced around at the faces of his commanders. There was no time to waste. The Zealers had shown no signs of slowing down, and the human forces were being pushed to their breaking point. But 48 hours, could they hold out that long? "We'll buy you that time," Dalton said finally. His voice was firm, carrying the weight of 100 battles. "We won't let the Zealers take another inch of this planet. I'll need every soldier we have to launch a diversion. We'll draw their attention away from your location and give you the breathing room you need." Ortiz, who had been silently watching, nodded. "We'll hit them hard, General. Keep them focused on us, while Dr. Miles finishes the cannon." The plan was set. The resistance forces scattered across the planet would coordinate a series of attacks, launching everything they had at the Zealers to keep them off balance. They would fight with everything they had, not for victory, but for the chance to give humanity one final weapon. As the days passed, the fighting intensified. The air was thick with smoke and the constant roar of artillery. Soldiers moved in the shadows, striking at Zealer positions with guerrilla tactics, creating chaos and confusion wherever they could. The Zealers, for all their advanced technology, were not used to this kind of relentless, unpredictable warfare. Every strike they made was met with fierce retaliation, and they began to lose ground. Meanwhile, Dr. Miles worked tirelessly in the heart of a secret underground facility, her team scrambling to get the weapon ready. The hours were long, and the weight of failure hung heavy in the air. But with each passing moment, the cannon came closer to completion. Finally, after nearly 3 days of non-stop work, the cannon was ready. The power core had been stabilized, and its energy output was stronger than anyone had hoped for. Dr. Miles, exhausted but triumphant, stood before the massive weapon, now fully charged and ready for activation. Outside, the human forces made one final push. The Zealers, sensing something was different, began to concentrate their firepower on Earth's remaining strongholds. But just as the Zealers prepared for a decisive strike, humanity had one weapon left to play. Dalton stood on the battlefield, staring up at the massive energy cannon that now aimed toward the sky. It was their last hope, and they would not fail. "Let's show them what we're made of," he muttered, as the final assault began. The next move was humanity's. The energy cannon, humbling in its scale, loomed over the battlefield like a promise of salvation. General Dalton and his forces had fought tooth and nail to get to this moment. The Zealers were closing in, and Earth's cities were nothing more than a smoldering ruin of their former glory. But humanity's spirit was far from broken. They had one last chance to prove they could stand toe-to-toe with the invaders. The cannon would be their weapon of reckoning. Dr. Elara Miles, sweat trickling down her brow as she stood by the weapons console, activated the cannon's power systems with a sharp hiss of rising energy. Her heart raced as she glanced up at the massive targeting array, watching the redouts flicker to life. The ground trembled beneath their feet as a low hum resonated from the cannon's core, the immense power building to a critical level. The Zealer ships, hovering ominously in orbit above Earth, had been oblivious to the weapon being activated. But as the cannon powered up, the first subtle ripples in space-time became undeniable. The Zealer's sensors began to pick up a spike in energy, their scanners scanning frantically as they zeroed in on the source. "Target locked," Dr. Miles said with a shaky breath. She keyed in the final adjustments. "Ready for firing sequence." On the ground, General Dalton stood at the edge of the makeshift command center, watching the sky. The Zealers had deployed their ground forces to push through Earth's last remaining defenses, but now their focus was on the skies. The cannon was Earth's trump card, and it was humanity's last shot at survival. Dalton clenched his fist. "Prepare to fire." Ortiz and her squadron of soldiers had launched yet another diversionary attack on a Zealer stronghold a few miles from the cannon's location. Their mission was simple: keep the invaders' attention away long enough for the cannon to charge. It was a gamble, one that could either turn the tide of the war or end in disaster. Ortiz, crouching in the ruins of an old skyscraper, surveyed the battle raging ahead. The Zealer ground forces advanced in tightly packed formations, their hulking forms and mechanical weapons seeming unstoppable. But Ortiz knew the plan. She knew her soldiers had to give Dr. Miles just a few more minutes to charge the cannon. It would take all they had to keep the Zealers distracted. "Move out," Ortiz shouted as she signaled for her team to advance. The group charged into the heart of the Zealer position, setting off explosives and forcing the invaders into chaos. The explosions rippled through the ground, sending dust and debris flying as human forces fought valiantly, distracting the alien invaders. In orbit, the Zealers began to take notice. The hum of the cannon had not gone unnoticed, and now the massive warships in the sky adjusted their weapons, aiming their deadly arrays at the target on the ground. It was clear. The cannon was the only thing standing between Earth's survival and utter destruction. Dr. Miles activated the final sequence, and the entire facility trembled. Charging complete. Firing in 3, 2, 1. A blinding flash of light tore through the sky. The cannon's shot ripped through the atmosphere with a force that rattled the very earth beneath their feet. A massive beam of pure energy shot upward, piercing the Zealer command ship with an ear-shattering crack. The colossal ship trembled as the beam ripped through its hull, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. The Zealer fleet shuddered as the beam's energy cascaded outward, sending massive warships spiraling out of control. The sheer force of the blast decimated their command vessel, causing a massive explosion in the air. The energy beam cut through the Zealer's ships with devastating accuracy, sending chunks of alien metal and debris raining down onto the planet below. In the command center, Dalton and Dr. Miles watched the spectacle unfold on their screens. The weapon had worked beyond their expectations. Several of the Zealer's larger ships had been destroyed in an instant, and others had begun to break formation, retreating into deep space to regroup. "Direct hit," Dr. Miles whispered in awe. "We did it." But the battle was far from over. While the energy beam had crippled the Zealer's orbital forces, their ground troops were still advancing with brutal efficiency. Earth's last remaining cities were in danger of being completely wiped out unless they acted fast. "We've got their attention now," Dalton said, gritting his teeth. "Let's finish this." Ortiz's squad had pushed the Zealers to their breaking point, but the fight wasn't over. With the energy cannon's blast, they had bought humanity a brief moment of respite. The Zealers were reeling from the blow, but they wouldn't stay down for long. General Dalton's orders were clear. Earth would fight with everything it had, now more than ever. the last wave of humanity's resistance would be its fiercest. They had already proven the Zailers could be beaten. Now, it was time to finish what had been started. The dawn of reckoning had arrived. The energy cannon had struck a devastating blow to the Zailer fleet, but it was only a temporary reprieve. The ground war raged on, and despite the victory in the skies, humanity's forces were still heavily outnumbered. General Dalton knew that the Zailers, though reeling from their losses, would not retreat. Their kind did not yield. Earth's defense was hanging by a thread. As the last of the Zailer warships struggled to regain their footing, the enemy began to shift their strategy. The Zailers no longer relied solely on their orbital fleet. They began massing their ground troops, overwhelming humanity's resistance with sheer force. Hundreds of Zailer tanks and mechanized war walkers thundered across the planet's surface, their heavy weapons wreaking havoc on what was left of Earth's defenses. On the front lines, Colonel Ortiz surveyed the battlefield with grim determination. Her squad had taken heavy casualties in the last attack, but they had inflicted damage on the enemy too. The Zailers were disoriented, but they were regrouping quickly, and their numbers seemed endless. "We need reinforcements," Ortiz radioed into command, her voice tight with urgency. "They're pushing forward. Too many of them. Too fast." Dalton's voice crackled through her earpiece, calm but resolute. "Hold your ground, Ortiz. We can't afford to let them gain more territory. We've got one last chance to end this." The general wasn't talking about just a few skirmishes. He was speaking of a final, all-out assault on the Zailers' most fortified position, their command base. If humanity could destroy their leadership, they might force the invaders to retreat. It was a dangerous mission, one that would take everything they had. "Understood, General," Ortiz replied. "We'll keep them at bay." With that, she gave the order for her remaining forces to make a stand. Every soldier knew what was at stake. The enemy was relentless, but humanity's will to survive was stronger. Meanwhile, Dr. Miles was not resting on her laurels. She knew that the cannon's blast had given them a fighting chance, but it wouldn't be enough to win the war. She was working feverishly with her team of engineers, attempting to modify the cannon to fire again. The Zailers would come back in full force, and they would need more than one shot to keep the invaders at bay. "We need more power, more firepower," she muttered to herself, typing furiously on the console. "We can't stop now." Back at the front lines, the Zailers advanced, their mechanical legs pounding the ground like an unstoppable wave of death. They had learned from their earlier mistakes, and now they adapted their tactics to avoid falling victim to the same human ingenuity that had brought them so much pain. Their forces were well coordinated, more aggressive than before. Dalton stood at the command center, looking out at the chaos through the screens. His mind raced, trying to come up with a strategy to break the deadlock. They had inflicted significant damage, but he needed a way to force the Zailers into a retreat, or they would be wiped out. It was clear that Earth was running out of time, and that meant it was time to make the ultimate sacrifice. "Prepare for a full assault," Dalton ordered. "We go for their command base. If we can cripple their leadership, we can bring this war to an end." His voice was steady, but everyone knew the risks. A full assault on the Zailer command base was a suicide mission. The Zailers were entrenched, surrounded by advanced weaponry, and their defense systems were formidable. But humanity's fighters weren't about to let that stop them. Ortiz and her team were among the first to charge forward. Their objective was clear: reach the heart of the Zailer stronghold and disable their command center, no matter the cost. There was no more time for hesitation. The fight was unlike anything they had experienced before. The Zailers had fortified their command base with layers of defenses, laser turrets, energy shields, and countless drones swarming the skies. Humanity's forces pressed forward through fire and smoke, determined to break through. Ortiz led the charge, her rifle raised, firing into the oncoming Zailer troops. Her soldiers followed her into the fray, their faces grim but resolute. Every shot they fired, every step they took, was a step closer to the final objective. In the chaos of battle, It was impossible to tell who was winning. The earth beneath them trembled with explosions. The sky above was filled with the screeching roar of Zealer fighters, and the air was thick with smoke. The final push was in full motion, but Dalton knew this was only the beginning. He had given the order for all available forces to assault the heart of the Zealer stronghold, but humanity could not afford to lose focus. Every soldier, every resistance fighter, had to keep fighting. This war would end today, one way or another. And deep inside his heart, Dalton knew, if humanity was to survive, they would need to sacrifice everything. The world depended on it. The battle for Earth had escalated to its most desperate point. Every corner of the world was now a battleground. The once beautiful cities that humanity had built were now craters, their grandeur reduced to smoldering ruins. The air, thick with dust and smoke, tasted of ash. But amidst the devastation, humanity stood unyielding, fighting for their home, their future. General Dalton's orders were clear. Strike at the heart of the Zealer command base. Ortiz's squad was already in the thick of the battle, charging through waves of enemy soldiers. Each step forward felt like an eternity, but every inch of ground they gained brought them closer to the final goal, the command center that housed the Zealer leaders. Ortiz had always been a determined leader, but now, in the face of overwhelming odds, her focus was razor-sharp. Keep moving, she shouted, urging her team forward. Her heart raced as the sounds of laser fire and explosions filled the air. The Zealers were relentless, but so were they. With every step, Ortiz's squad pushed through barricades and trenches, their rifles blazing against the Zealers' advanced drones and mechanical soldiers. The enemy's forces had been scattered in the chaos, but their technological superiority was still evident. The Zealers were stronger, faster, and better equipped. But the humans had something they didn't, an unwavering determination to protect their world, their loved ones, and their future. As Ortiz and her team advanced, the sky above was filled with the thundering sound of the Zealer warships. Despite the damage they had suffered from the energy cannon, the Zealers were far from defeated. Their ships continued to fire down onto the Earth, causing widespread devastation wherever their weapons landed. Every explosion felt like a reminder of what was at stake. "We're almost there," Ortiz said, her voice steady, though her body ached from the unrelenting fight. "Push forward." Her team responded, their resolve as strong as ever. They had come so far, and they wouldn't back down now. The Zealers, realizing the humans were getting closer to their command base, began to rally their defenses. Heavy artillery was deployed, and powerful energy shields flickered into place around the base. It was the Zealers' last line of defense, and they were willing to throw everything they had to protect it. But humanity had learned from their mistakes. Ortiz's squad, already accustomed to guerrilla tactics, split into smaller groups, surrounding the command base from all sides. They would need to outsmart the Zealers to win. On the other side of the battlefield, General Dalton continued to coordinate with the remaining human forces. Their numbers had dwindled, but the fight was not over. "We have to finish this," he muttered, his voice tight with determination. He knew that this would be humanity's last stand, a fight for their very survival. Dr. Miles, still working tirelessly on the cannon, was now faced with a difficult decision. She had completed the cannon's modifications, but the energy required for a second shot would drain the remaining power reserves. If they fired again, there would be no backup. It would be all or nothing. But with the Zealers closing in on the command center, Dr. Miles knew the time to act was now. "Fire," she ordered, her voice steady despite the tension building in her chest. The cannon fired once more, a brilliant beam of energy streaking through the atmosphere. It struck one of the Zealer warships with pinpoint accuracy, tearing through its massive hull and sending it spiraling toward the Earth. The explosion that followed was deafening, a reminder of the weapon's incredible power. The Zealers, stunned by the loss of one of their flagship ships, scrambled to regroup. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless, and as the cannon powered down, humanity pushed forward, undeterred. The time for hesitation was over. Ortiz and her squad breached the outer perimeter of the Zaylor command base, and the final push had begun. They fought with everything they had, pushing through barricades and taking down enemy soldiers with ruthless efficiency. Their path was clear. The command center, now within their reach, stood tall, its walls heavily fortified. But Ortiz and her team weren't afraid. "Get to the control room," Ortiz ordered, leading the charge toward the heart of the base. Inside the base, the Zaylor leaders were scrambling to assess the situation. They had underestimated humanity's resolve, and now they were paying the price. But even as they began to prepare their final defenses, they knew it was too late. The humans were already inside, and they would stop at nothing to take back their planet. Dalton's voice came through the comms once more. "This is it. We take down their leadership, and we win. Do not let up." As Ortiz and her squad infiltrated the command center, every shot fired, every Zaylor they took down, was one step closer to humanity's victory. The air was thick with tension, but as the final doors opened, they knew there was no turning back. The last stand had begun, and no matter the cost, humanity would fight until the very end. Inside the heart of the Zaylor command base, Ortiz and her squad moved with relentless precision. Every hallway they crossed, every room they cleared, brought them closer to the Zaylor leaders. The base's walls were a cold, metallic gray, and the flickering lights above only added to the atmosphere of dread that hung in the air. But it wasn't fear that drove them forward. It was their undying resolve to end the invasion once and for all. "We're almost there," Ortiz muttered, her voice low as she peered around the corner. Her rifle was steady in her hands, and her team was ready for whatever came next. Every soldier knew the stakes. They were about to face the Zaylor's most powerful leaders, the ones who had orchestrated the destruction of Earth. But the path to victory was now clear. They had to end this now. The control room, where the Zaylor leadership was believed to be holed up, stood ahead. As they approached, the base grew eerily quiet, the buzz of distant machinery the only sound. The Zaylors were preparing for their final stand. It was now or never. Ortiz motioned for her team to stop. She pressed her back to the wall and signaled for the rest to fan out. "We breach in 5. Get ready." The team nodded, their faces set in grim determination. Their weapons were charged, and their minds were focused. There was no fear. They had already come too far to stop now. The Zaylors had invaded their world, taken lives, burned cities, and shattered everything humanity had worked for. But that was all going to end here. At Ortiz's command, they stormed into the control room, weapons raised. Inside, several high-ranking Zaylor officials were scrambling to respond to the breach, their alien faces twisting in surprise. These were the masterminds of the invasion, the ones who had engineered Earth's downfall. But as soon as the doors burst open, Ortiz and her squad unleashed a barrage of gunfire, cutting down any Zaylor that dared to move. The room was chaos. Zaylors scrambled behind consoles, activating defense shields, but it was too late. Humanity's forces were upon them, overwhelming their defenses. Ortiz's squad moved in tight formation, sweeping through the room with ruthless efficiency. Ortiz spotted the Zaylor commander, tall, imposing, with a helmet that reflected a cold, calculating intelligence. The leader was trying to make an escape, moving toward a hidden exit at the far end of the room. But Ortiz wasn't going to let that happen. "No one escapes," she growled, leaping forward and firing a single shot that struck the Zaylor commander directly in the chest. The alien staggered, falling to the ground with a thud. The leader's final breath escaped, and the room fell into a stunned silence. The rest of the Zaylor officials, now leaderless, looked around in confusion and fear. Without the command structure to direct them, they were easy targets. Ortiz and her squad quickly neutralized the remaining threats. In the control room, the final victory was within their grasp. Ortiz's heart pounded in her chest, but she knew this was the moment that would define the outcome of the war. The Zaylors had invaded, they had destroyed, but they were not invincible. Humanity's resilience was more powerful than any alien technology. Outside, the remnants of the Zealer forces on the battlefield had begun to falter. With their leadership gone, their coordination collapsed. The remaining Zealer soldiers were disoriented, vulnerable. Earth's forces pressed forward, pushing the invaders back with everything they had. The ground shook with the force of humanity's final push, a wave of resistance that no alien army could withstand. Dr. Miles, watching the battle unfold from her command center, allowed herself a moment of relief. The cannon had given humanity a fighting chance, but the real victory had come on the ground. The Zealers had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt, to survive, and to fight back. With their leadership destroyed and their forces scattered, the war was effectively over. As the last of the Zealers on Earth were driven back, General Dalton stood with his commanders in the command center, watching the final reports come in. The battle was won. The invaders had been repelled. Earth was free. Dalton took a long breath, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on him. "We did it," he said quietly, though his voice held no joy, only exhaustion. "Humanity has won, but the cost was great. So many lives lost." He turned to Dr. Miles, who stood nearby, her face pale and tired but resolute. "You gave us a chance," he said. "Without you, we would have never made it this far." Dr. Miles nodded, her expression somber. "We all did, and now we rebuild." The war was over, but the real work was just beginning. The world would never be the same, but humanity had shown its true strength. Against all odds, they had fought back against an overwhelming force, and they had won. Earth was safe, for now, but the scars of the war would remain, and humanity would have to rebuild not just their cities, but their future. It had been a war for survival, a war fought with fire and fury, and humanity had answered, not just with weapons, but with something much stronger: hope, unity, and an unbreakable will to live. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, the first glimmers of a new dawn broke through the smoke-filled sky. The world was broken, but it was still theirs, and humanity would rise again.